Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Cenizos natural processed Panama from Meow Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Meow, based out of Tsing, Hong Kong, and this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed their wash processed Cenizos. And as I've said in the past, when trying out a brand new coffee roaster for the first time, I usually like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings. So this one also has the benefit of coming from the same producer. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how the natural version of this coffee turned out. As this right here is day 49. And recipe we went with for this coffee was also our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. Brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So I did mention in our previous review of Meow that they were on the slightly lighter side of things. This one did feel like it had a slight bit more development to it than the wash processed one did. So I feel like by that logic, this one could be considered on the slightly more developed side of that light profile or on the slightly lighter side of that light medium by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was in line with the expectations of a natural processed Panamanian geisha, as the listed raspberry attributes were quite pronounced with an abundance of the honeyed components and a general fruit-forward sweetness. A bit of some tropical aspects giving the coffee a bit of additional depth as well, so for the most part, pretty much in line with a lot of the expectations that we had for this coffee. Day 27 through the Chemex, and the coffee does continue to offer plenty of intensity, especially within the red fruit sense, as the listed raspberry is the most prominent characteristic within this coffee, complemented by a pretty intense honeyed aspect as well. Very syrupy and nectar-like with a very concentrated stone fruit intensity as well. And this coffee did slightly remind me of some of the very old Manhattan coffees that we had reviewed in the past, some of the much more processed ones, especially in terms of that honeyed component to it, mostly because of just how unique and strong that was within this coffee. Day 30 through the April brewer, and there are some mixed results as this coffee does continue to skew heavily in the red fruit sense, though there is a decent level of definition, but additionally there's much more of the strong honey-like feel once again. And I continue to highlight those two traits and characteristics of this coffee mostly because those really seem to dominate the majority of the time. Still lacking the desired level of clarity, as it does continue to remain relatively heavy and concentrated all around. Day 33 through the V60 with Meow's recipe, which does indicate some slightly lower temperatures, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it was slightly cleaner, though it was still slightly robust, and that's what I'm referencing when I discuss the profile of this coffee, being, I would say, just a little bit more robust than I might have expected. Mostly red fruit forward, yet again with a better balanced honey aspect. Additionally, plenty of the heavier stone fruit, so I could definitely see a very sort of syrupy, tropical, mango-like nectar within this one. Day 36 through the Chemex with Meow's recipe, and even lower temperatures, and it has reverted slightly back to the focus being on the heavier red fruit aspects of this one. There are a bit more of the listed tropical components, but the primary focus remains on the more heavy syrupy aspects of this coffee. And then on day 39, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and interestingly enough, the coffee was by far the best that it had been to this point, as there was just notably better clarity and definition to it all around, with the red berry tones giving it a slight raspberry jello-like feel with a very strong honey and tropical syrupy aspect once again. And I've highlighted and focused on those three aspects at this moment a lot, mostly because those continue to remain the most dominant characteristics within this coffee. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there was much more depth that I was getting outside of that, as on day 42 we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and there's inconsistency to this coffee as well because we just went back and replicated exactly what we had done on the previous day, and it was just a bit more heavy with less definition to those red fruits again. This time there was a bit more of a strong citric quality that seemed to dominate, with the honey aspects having the same amount of intensity as it had in the past, but this time with a slight bit more bitterness to it. Alright, let's go and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so we'll go ahead and start with the finish. Level 4, Actually, I think we can discuss the finish and the sweetness side by side, as both of them did reach that level 4 mark. And that's probably one of the saving graces of this coffee, because I continuously mention that when it comes to slightly more processed coffees, especially when they are skewing in the red fruits direction, they can easily trend into the category of being overbearing, especially if they do have that very intense level 5 finish and sweetness for them. This coffee once again towed that line, and I would say it actually came pretty close a lot of the time, but for the most part it stayed there. I don't think it was necessarily helped by the fact that there was that very strong, intense honey aspect that also seemed to kind of give it a much more lingering finish than I would have necessarily liked. So both those things at the higher side of the level 4, and I would say not necessarily the most desirable sense for me. Acidity, level 4. Once again, kind of interesting about this coffee roaster, it seems like they do appreciate and really like to focus on the brightness of their coffees, because when it comes to Panama and Geishas, I can usually have it somewhere in the 3 range a lot of the time, especially with some very light profiled coffee roasters. But this one right here just continues to kind of trend in that direction, as both the coffees we've had from them have been, I would say, a bit brighter than I might have expected. So plenty of acidity within this one. We move on to the florals, level 4, and I do have to say that this had a much more heavier floral aspect to it, as it had those very strong, I would say, intense, darker perfuming florals within this one, which does tend to be a very common characteristic within natural processed coffees. We move on to the berry fruit, level 4, and once again, I'm very happy that it didn't reach that level 5 mark, because this one was on the verge of getting to that point. There's a very strong raspberry aspect, and I think when brewing this coffee, I took in the aroma, noting that I was going to be probably pretty red fruit forward, and then actually trying the coffee and finding out that it was, not just in that sense, but also with that complementary heavier honey sense, then it just kind of not necessarily overly desirable in that regard. Citrus fruit, level 4, and that actually came in a little bit more towards the end, as for the most part it wasn't that citric forward, and towards the end I just kind of noticed that it came through a little bit more than on some of the earlier days. So it gave the berry fruit, I would say, at least a little bit of depth in terms of the fruit qualities, as there was even a bit of a tropical citric fruit that was also present within this one. We move on to the level 3s, and we will start with the stone fruit level 3. We actually don't have too many level 3s, so the stone fruit level 3, even though I mentioned a lot of the times that there was a very heavier, more tropical nectar-like aspect, towards the end when I made this tasting wheel, the citrus fruit seemed to overtake that as the second most predominant fruit quality within this coffee, so that we decided to put at the level 3. And then 2 more things we're discussing. We'll move on to the body level 2. That's kind of strange to me. The natural had less body than the washed. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. This one right here was a little bit lighter bodied in general, even with it having that kind of more syrupy consistency to the fruit qualities. And then the final thing we're discussing is the cleanliness level 3. And I think the best day was that second to last day that we'd had of this coffee, where the definition was, I would say, a little bit more pronounced. And on that day, I could see it maybe being on the slightly higher side of level 3. But for the most part, given that this coffee had a fair bit of fermentiness to it throughout the majority of it, it was always going to be really surprising if it scored any higher than a level 3. Sometimes it's a battle to even reach that level 3 mark, but this one did. So I would say credit to it in that regard, but obviously I do want my naturals, especially Panamanian Geishas, to be a little cleaner. So having it at the level 3 does kind of give me some mixed impressions, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I said in our washed Los Cenizos review that I was probably going to discuss that one a little bit more in this review, and it's to basically say that I had a very strong preference towards that coffee, even if that coffee was still inconsistent and by the end it wasn't necessarily to the standard that I was hoping for. This one was just, I would say, a little bit too much like the modern natural processed coffee for me, where it's used a little bit too much in the red fruit sense, a little too fermenty, a little bit too heavy, and a little bit just too, in this case, slightly more robust than I might have hoped for. Outside of that, it was a little bit more intense and overbearing, even if it didn't necessarily reach the extent where I've had from a lot of natural processed coffees in general. So that's to say that this one, not necessarily my favorite, but it was at least a different experience with a different Panamanian Geisha. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like your much more prominent red fruit aspects, then this one's a pretty good fit in that sense. Outside of that, I would say that I think it just offers a very unique honeyed feel to it. I didn't even mention that too much when I was kind of going through this coffee towards the end. I don't necessarily like the very dominant honey aspects that are present in a lot of these coffees, but if you do, then kind of couple those two things together, and it gave it a little bit of a uniqueness that I haven't necessarily felt from too many natural processed coffees in general. That honey aspect was just a little bit more unique than I usually experience. So I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Los Cenizos Natural Processed Panama from Red Meow Coffee Roastery. Thanks for watching.